Hey everyone, today I'm going to talk about the 7 ways of stopping yourself from being too nice. Do people tell you that you're too nice all the time? Do you feel like you get pushed around, even if it's by your own employees or direct reports? If so, this video is for you. How nice you are is measured by trait agreeableness. This is largely regulated by serotonin and your sex hormones such as testosterone and estrogen. Now, trait agreeableness is divided into 2 spectrums. On one end of the spectrum are people who prioritize harmony, who prioritize getting along. On the other end of the spectrum are people who don't mind conflict, who have more energy for conflict. And in the middle are what we call the negotiators. And these are the people who, look for harmony and don't mind conflict, but they can't handle too much of both ends. They tend to look for win-win situations. Nice people are appreciated. They tend to prioritize others' needs over their own needs. And as a result, they tend to cooperate better with the employer and they perform better in teamwork situations. Agreeable people also tend to find themselves in customer service situations, right? Because they are those who like to deal with people and they like to please others and fulfill their needs. However, there are times where being agreeable doesn't really work in your favor. So for example, agreeable people are worse at negotiating for wages. They just are, because they tend to not have a lot of energy to push for their own agenda. They also tend to settle into lower paying occupations or positions. They also have lower manipulative power, which is also known as the Machiavellian intelligence, which is basically at the higher level, when you need to compete with the sharks, agreeable people are in trouble because they don't have the energy, they don't have the scheming, the conniving to deal with all the backstabbing and all the different ways to undermine the opponent. Also, agreeable people tend to win less at the bargaining table in sales situations. So not only do they win less for themselves in terms of the wages they can argue for, they also tend to sell worse because the other person who's buying will be asking for a lower price and you don't have that much energy to argue back and they tend to give in more. As a result, agreeableness's impact is measurable throughout a lifetime. Did you know that a study in 2018 found that agreeable people earn on average about 8% less than disagreeable people in lifetime earnings? That's a lot. That's almost like 10% of your lifetime's income. Now, there are several ways to deal with being too agreeable, right? There's ways to lower it. And right now, I'm going to give you 7 strategies on how to deal with that. Strategy number 1. The first strategy is to attend an assertiveness training course. And there are a lot of those out there. For example, there are body language courses that teach you how to conduct yourself. As a lot of you guys would know, about 90% of communication is through body language, tonality, emotions, and all the other things. Only about 10% of communication is actually the words that are being spoken. So attending an assertiveness training course on stuff such as body language would be helpful. So one thing I saw in terms of body language is an example of paper manspreading. And when I say paper manspreading, I mean when you're in a room and you put your paper in a neat little pile in front of you, that doesn't really signal a lot of clout. That means you're orderly and you're in line. So one thing to do if you're too agreeable is to intentionally spread that paper out. It's kind of like paper manspreading across the table to signal that you have clout and that you are a force to be reckoned with. The second thing that I would recommend is read books on negotiation skills. Negotiation is a tactic. So in the middle of the trait agreeableness are negotiators, right? And so if you're a negotiator, you look for win-win situations. On the highly agreeable side, it tends to be about helping the other person win and compromising your own desires. On the disagreeable side, it's more about you winning. Right? So reading books on negotiation skills would be helpful. So a classic I would recommend is Roger Fisher's Getting to Yes. That book is about finding win-win situations. The third thing I would recommend is to find a coach who is moderately less agreeable than you. So if you hire an agreeableness, find a coach who is in the middle for agreeableness, because they'll be able to understand both your perspective and a disagreeable person's perspective. I would recommend against finding a disagreeable coach, a coach who has a lot of energy to be disagreeable, because they won't understand your perspective. They'll be like, just say no, or like just argue back. But agreeable people simply don't have that type of energy to deal with conflict all the time. So the best way to do it is to find a coach who is a negotiator, someone who's in the middle. So the fourth thing I would recommend is to learn to recognize early on when you're losing control of the situation and when you're losing momentum, and then reassert yourself and state what you need. Oftentimes, people who are agreeable, it's a pattern. It happens all the time. It's a recurring thing. Your friends tell you, you recognize it yourself, and you always tell yourself, there's not going to be a next time. But the reality is, there tends to be a next time. So if that's the case, there are often triggers that you would be able to recognize, whether the trigger is within yourself or whether it's a pattern that you see happen time and again. So when you get into those situations and you start noticing this pattern, just take a pause for a second, gather yourself, and reassert yourself. The fifth recommendation that I have is whenever you hear someone tell you what's important to them, automatically think to yourself, well, what is important to me in this situation? When the answer is clear, speak it. Because if you don't speak it, it's not going to happen. No one's going to know what you think. So I'll give you an example. And this example it happens to me almost on a daily basis. I'm a negotiator. I'm right in the middle. So I tend to look for win-win situations. My wife, on the other hand, is more agreeable than me. And so in situations where we both sit down and we decide, hey, let's pick out a movie to watch, I would say, hey, I want to watch this. And the movies that I like tend to be horror, or they tend to be action or thrillers and so on. My wife, on the other hand, doesn't enjoy going on emotional roller coasters when she's watching a movie. She prefers to watch something more steady, just lighthearted, happy, kind of like a chick flick kind of thing. When I state what I want and she states what she wants, and then I restate what I want, she tends to be like, okay, I'll go with you, right? But if that happens for like 6, 7, 8 times in a row, what happens is one day she'll finally snap and say, you know what, John? You never care about how I feel. You don't care about the movies that I like to watch. So screw you. Forget this. We're not watching a movie. And for me, it's like, where'd this come from? I thought we're getting along all the time. We're about to pick a movie. But it turns out that it's not what she wants, right? And for her, she told me once and she expects me to pick it up. And that's kind of the pattern about agreeable people, right? They'll tell you what they want, but then they won't really push hard for it. But when they feel like they've been bullied a lot or like pushed around a lot, they might finally snap. But then when it comes to that point, it's kind of like a surprise to everyone. It's like people are like, wait, aren't you cool with this all the time? Why you suddenly change? Kind of a lot of negativity, a lot of energy gets pent up all the time if you don't state what you want, because people simply don't know what you want. So the sixth and seventh advice that I have for agreeable people is if you are already in kind of a leadership position. So a typical leader is lower in trait agreeableness because they're able to push for their own agenda. If you're a leader with high agreeableness, that might work against you. So one of the things that I would recommend for leaders who are higher in agreeableness is to delegate the leader role to someone else. That's not to say you don't call the shots, but it's more about you have someone else who is lower in the trait agreeableness who is able to say no. If there's an understanding between you and the person who is lower in trait agreeableness, and they're the ones handling all the rejections and maintaining the focus on the agenda, your life will be much easier because you don't have to be dealing with pushing away people and saying no to people. The seventh suggestion that I have is if you are in a leadership role, I would recommend you, after you're done a presentation about a certain project or whatnot, for you to ask others to ask you questions. And the reason for that is because it gives you an opportunity to voice out your thoughts and your opinions on something before everyone in the room starts giving their input and chiming in and throwing the whole task out of hand. Because if you're in a leadership position, being agreeable means that it's going to take a lot of energy. It's going to be draining to say no to people all the time. So prompting others to ask you questions would be very helpful. So that's all the advice I have for agreeable people today. And if you like this video, leave a comment, give it a like, and share it with others. And of course, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell. Take care.